So I was getting ready to do the next storytime video, this one, and I asked the question, should I do reading the newspaper or window shades? And the only response I got was, quote, I'm going to say the newspaper because that sounds so utterly normal that it has to be a good story. So, a story about reading the newspaper. Now this starts by an introduction to my great-grandparents. My great-grandparents were born and raised in Russia. They were Volga Germans, which were the Germans that were given land along the Volga River when Catherine the Great offered that to German citizens after one of the ever so many wars. Basically what it was is citizens of Germany were given the tools to start out and were sent to the Volga River to basically tame the Wild East instead of the Wild West as it is here in the US. And they were descendants of those people, and their families had been in that area along the Volga for... The first family was actually among, or the first of the family was actually among the very first people to go out there. So they'd been out there for between 500 and 700 years, depending on who you talk to. But just before the Bolsheviks took over, and there was the Octobrists and the Revolution, and my great-grandparents decided that politics were changing things and they didn't want to be there anymore. So my great-grandfather and a few others of the men pooled their resources, and they all got passage to the US, and they all got work, and they all worked together, and they sent money back home for the wives and whatever children wanted to come along. And not everybody did. There's still relatives over there, or at least there were until the Volga Germans got rounded up and sent off to Siberian work camps. It's a whole thing. Anyway, my great-grandma and great-grandpa grew up in Russia. And they were pretty typical peasant workers. And they had a farm, they knew how to work the land. My great-grandpa was this really, really chill guy with a great sense of humor. It was really hard to get on his bad side. If he'd tell an inappropriate joke, he would giggle like a little schoolgirl because it's just what he did. Great-grandma was what is commonly known as a battle axe. It was rumored, and with good reason, that the daughters of the family married off young so that they could get out from under her thumb. She was one of those. Now, this happened often. This is a story that was told to me by my grandmother. And she was the first of the family to be born in the United States. So, this was after they had become US citizens and had been in the States for a while. And after they had had more children. My great-grandmother on the Kippes side, on Grandma's side, had 12 children altogether. Though I think only 7 actually made it to adulthood. And of those 7, not very many made it to actually getting married and having children and such. They did better than Grandpa's side of the family, but you know, there were things like being conscripted into the Russian army and not being able to make it to the States, and the work camps, and. There was a lot going on. But you can imagine that great-grandma Kippes, after spending all day with 5 or 6 young children underfoot, got a little cranky. So, Papa, as he was known, would get up, and Mama would have been up already and had made his lunch, packed his lunch, and Papa would get up and go off to work in the fields, normally tending the sugar beets, which is hard physical labor. But he would go out, and he would be out in the beet fields and working all day, and Mama would be at home trying to get all the household everything done with 5 or 6 children underfoot. And Papa would come home, and he would pick up his newspaper, and he'd light his pipe because he was very rarely seen without his pipe. And he would sit down in his chair, and he would start reading the newspaper. And Mama, being Mama, wanted her complaints to be heard. She wanted it known that she was unhappy with the children. She wanted it known exactly what had gone on during the day, and wanted it known that she had a voice in all this, and she was very dissatisfied, and this is exactly why. So she would start. And she would go, 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 and she would go. And after about, normally about a half an hour to an hour, she'd get wound up and wound up and wound up. And eventually, she'd get it all, mostly out of her system. Not all the way, mostly out of her system. And she'd start winding down again, and you could always tell because her voice would change, and she'd start breathing normally because she would get worked up that she'd be snorting and stomping and stamping all over the house. And about the time as she calmed down, without fail, at least once a month, Papa, who had the newspaper up in front of his face, would very carefully fold the top of the newspaper down and look up at Great-Grandma, take the pipe out of his mouth, and look at her and go, "Now, Mama, what did you say?" And then very slowly and very deliberately put the pipe back in his mouth and slowly pull the newspaper back up to his face and hide behind it, because that would just set her off again, and he would sit there and giggle like a schoolgirl behind his newspaper, because he knew exactly how to push Mama's buttons, and he had fun doing it.